Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Protecting the People panel discussion hosted by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. Today's discussion is the final webinar of the recently launched Safe Water for All campaign, a new educational effort to help keep the public informed about the state of water in Wisconsin. My name is Bruce Reinick, and I am the Groundwater Section Chief at the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. My section oversees the implementation of the rule-setting groundwater standards and manages the operations of the Groundwater Coordinating Council. This webinar is being live streamed on YouTube. At the end of today's discussion, we'll hold a brief session for a panel Q&A. If you have any questions for us after the session, please feel free to send them to dnrpress@wisconsin.gov, and we'll have an expert get in contact with you. Almost 40 years ago, Wisconsin led the nation in drinking water protection with the passage of the 1983 Groundwater Law. During today's webinar, we will focus on building from Wisconsin's history of water conservation to continue providing adequate supplies of uncontaminated groundwater, which is the source for approximately 2/3 of Wisconsinites' drinking water. Our panel today includes Steve Elmore, the Program Director for the Wisconsin DNR's Bureau of Drinking Water and Groundwater. Steve oversees the delivery of safe drinking water in Wisconsin. In his 20 years at the DNR, he has served in areas of drinking water, groundwater, and water conservation. Dr. Jennifer Hauxwell, the Associate Director at the University of Wisconsin Aquatic Sciences Center. In her role, Jennifer provides leadership, strategic planning, and administration for all research-related activities of the Aquatic Science Center. Dr. Jonathan Meiman, the Chief Medical Officer and State Epidemiologist for Environmental Health at the Wisconsin Division of Public Health. Dr. Meiman serves as the state's medical consultant for the environmental and occupational diseases. And with that, I will turn it over to Steve. Steve, take it away.
Thanks a lot for that introduction, Bruce. Thanks everyone for joining us. Wisconsin does have a long history of protecting the state's waters and, as Bruce stated, led the nation in drinking water protection with the passage of the 1983 Groundwater Law. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. Approximately 2/3 of the people living in Wisconsin get their drinking water from groundwater. We manage Wisconsin's groundwater to protect public health, sustain our economy, and preserve our natural resources. This is a particular concern for more than 70% of Wisconsin residents who get their drinking water from groundwater. Wisconsin depends heavily on groundwater for its drinking water. There are about 11,000 public drinking water systems and over 800,000 private wells that use groundwater as their source of drinking water. While for the great majority of these wells, the water is of high quality and safe to drink, the low cost pollution from human activities and natural sources does occur across Wisconsin. Protecting groundwater sustains our economy. Wisconsin depends heavily on groundwater to irrigate crops, water cattle, and process a wide variety of foods. And this is what I mean by sustaining our economy. Without adequate groundwater of good quality, we couldn't do these activities. Other groups concerned about groundwater quality include farmers who rely on safe groundwater for crops and livestock production, and business owners who rely on groundwater for manufacturing and commerce. Protecting groundwater preserves Wisconsin's natural resource. Groundwater feeds trout streams and spring-fed lakes, all of which are vital to the state's economy. Lakes, rivers, and streams are fed by groundwater. Fish and wildlife can't thrive when groundwater contaminants impact the surface water they are dependent on now and to the future. Wisconsin has a long and proud history of groundwater protection. Wisconsin's groundwater law that was adopted in 1983 is held up as one of the nation's model environmental laws, in part because of its robust, science-based process for protecting the quality of our groundwater and public health. For 36 years, this law has guided the process that the Department of Health Services and the Department of Natural Resources follow, ensuring a scientifically rigorous review of available technical information and clarity on how recommended groundwater standards are selected. The groundwater law sets groundwater standards, and those are contained in Chapter NR 140, in order to minimize polluting substances in groundwater, thereby protecting public health, welfare, and the environment. Wisconsin's groundwater quality standards are used for regulating facilities, practices, and activities that can affect groundwater. They apply to bottled water, approved agricultural chemicals, contamination site cleanup, regulation of solid waste landfills, and much more. These are just some of the example activities that are regulated by the state, and those regulations point to our groundwater standards that are contained in NR 140. All right, with that introduction to groundwater standards, now we're gonna talk a little bit about the Groundwater Coordinating Council. The groundwater law that we referred to back in 1983 also formed the Groundwater Coordinating Council in 1984 to help state agencies for efficient groundwater protection and management. For over 35 years, the Groundwater Coordinating Council has been a model for interagency coordination and collaboration among state agencies, local and federal government, and the university. This coordination avoids duplication, creates efficiencies, and provides numerous benefits to Wisconsin taxpayers. To highlight some of the work of the Groundwater Coordinating Council, I'm going to show a short video here. And so please enjoy and learn something about groundwater and the Coordinating Council.
Groundwater it's used by everybody everywhere for many, many, many things.
Most people don't know where their water supply comes from. You turn the tap on and it comes out. It's our washing, our bathing, our showering, our doing our laundry, our drinking, whatever. But we irrigate for agriculture. You know, even in the city of Madison, you might have a microbrewery, or maybe you have an industry that uses water.
We have an abundance of agriculture that can grow some really unique crops for us. That diversity makes Wisconsin agriculture much stronger, but it also means that we rely on our resources, both the soil, our nutrients, our pesticides, as well as our water quality.
In order to manage a resource well, you have to be able to look at all of the possible uses of it.
The Groundwater Coordinating Council is basically a way for state agencies or other organizations within the state of Wisconsin to kind of coordinate or talk about groundwater concerns or groundwater issues.
We have the DNR, which of course has a lot to do with groundwater, but also the Department of Health, and the Department of Transportation, the university, the State Geological Survey, and others who have a stake in groundwater. And it's a really very useful place for people to talk about what each agency is doing, and that avoids overlap, it avoids duplication of effort.
You know, someone that works at the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources might be setting groundwater standards. Somebody from the Department of Health is investigating or studying water quality and developing health-based guidelines. Department of Safety and Professional Services, the agency in charge of regulating septic system and septic system design. And that's really the goal and the genius of the GCC, is that it recognizes that, you know, we all need to work together to protect the resource.
It's one of the major funding mechanisms we have for groundwater research here in the state.
I think that the Groundwater Coordinating Council and the law that created it is a real textbook example of what we should be trying to do and trying to get back to when you're dealing with public policy and water. That is that we purposely set up a system that said how we're going to approach these critically important subjects is going to be driven by science and by an interdisciplinary collection of scientists.
It's that collaborative effort where we may have information as regulatory agencies, but it's the educators, it's the university that really can play a really significant role in helping farmers and others understand the impacts of what they're doing and the choices that they make.
And that's why this law has been used for 35 years to address 138 compounds in a way that I think has produced some of the most scientifically defensible and important standards for protecting our groundwater quality here in Wisconsin.
If you want to think of it in economic terms, groundwater is an economic driver. We can't have a healthy economy without good water resources, but also it's an environmental need. We need to maintain Wisconsin's great environment for tourism, recreation, and business.
I think the definition of being a good steward of the land has now expanded, that being good stewards of the land also includes what's below the land, which is the groundwater.
All right, well, thanks so much, Steve, and for the team for sharing that video. So I'm happy to pick it up from here. I'm Jennifer Hauxwell, and I serve as the Associate Director for UW-Madison's Aquatic Sciences Center. Our center is home to 2 UW system programs. It's home to the University of Wisconsin Water Resources Institute and also the University of Wisconsin's Sea Grant College program. So both of these programs represent federal-state partnerships. They belong to national networks of similar programs in various states and territories across the country. I wanted to sort of introduce kind of this challenge, and I think there are a lot of equations in science. But the one that I'm showing here is really the most complicated equation that I've ever tried to solve that involves science. And that's really, how do you combine these things? It relies on care and hard work and relationships and trust. And so how do you best combine science, which is how we get good information, with people who care? And so these are stakeholders or engaged citizens, communities, businesses, industries, resource managers, and policymakers. How do you best do that? Because really, if you're successful, then you've got all the ingredients you need for sound decisions, science that's actionable, and the greater positive impacts on our resources and society. And I wanted to just thank you all out there in the audience today for joining us, because just by joining us, you're a part of this equation. You're one of those people who care, and I appreciate your attendance today. Working together as a team is really what we need to do in order to take care of Wisconsin's waters. We've been talking about groundwater here as the focus, but we're also so fortunate that we've got 15,000 lakes, we've got 80,000 miles of rivers and streams. We're bordered by 2 Great Lakes and the Great Mississippi River. And Wisconsin has about 1.2 billion gallons of water underground. If this water were above ground, it would submerge the state in about 100 feet of water. And as Steve mentioned, this is the drinking water source for most of us in the state. But despite this wealth of water that we have in Wisconsin, we still have so much work to do to protect water quality, water quantity, and also to make science-informed management decisions about these waters. So building bridges between researchers and the communities that they serve to address Wisconsin's water challenges sort of fits right in with our mission at the Aquatic Sciences Center. And it's truly sort of an embodiment of the Wisconsin idea. And that concept is sort of where the knowledge that's gained through research at the state's universities is used to help the people of the state. And so the next slide, the work of the Groundwater Coordinating Council fits also right in with this model of partnership, as you heard. UW system, through our Water Resources Institute, is a member of the Groundwater Coordinating Council, which we just learned about in the video, along with several state agencies agencies. So the council, it includes high-level leaders of all of the state agencies that have some responsibility for groundwater management, plus a governor's representative. And it really provides consistency and coordination across these agencies and the university. And really helps build connections, and so that folks from the different agencies and university working on different challenges are aware of what each other are doing. The university is at the table to hear about those challenges and to hopefully then conduct research and monitoring that helps address those challenges, and then also report back on results as research results come in. The group meets quarterly, and there is an annual report to the legislature. So if anybody is curious, this report's posted online. You can find it if you search for Wisconsin Groundwater Research and Monitoring Program, or the Wisconsin, if you just search for the Wisconsin Groundwater Coordinating Council, you'll find this report as well. So like I said, an annual report listed on the website there. So an incredible program that this team administers is called the Wisconsin Groundwater Research and Monitoring Program. And I'm here to talk a little bit more about the research and monitoring piece here as a part of the Groundwater Coordinating Council. So collectively, the goal of this program is to identify and support research that will answer key scientific questions that will advance our understanding and effective management of groundwater in the state. This is basically an annual competition for researchers. We call it the joint solicitation. The funding this year, this joint solicitation is open now. We're asking researchers to come to the table with their best ideas. We have about $375,000 available for new projects that will start in June of 2022. The nice thing about doing this jointly in the joint solicitation is that it's a team approach. So this is really sort of a one-stop shop for researchers that are interested in seeking groundwater funding from UW System, DNR, or the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection. The folks that are eligible are UW System researchers, state and local agencies, plus many partners often are parts of these proposals and projects. And this picture here is just an image of what our current joint solicitation for projects looks like. The proposals are due at the end of this month, and then they go through a really lengthy review process for scientific merit. We want to fund good science, and also making sure that the work is relevant for state needs. Collectively, since its inception, this program's funded almost 500 groundwater projects. And as mentioned earlier, it's really helped establish Wisconsin as a national and even international leader in groundwater research. But we still have so much work to be done. And so the next slide. This image summarizes the types of challenges and issues that we seek to help in solving in our current joint solicitation. So what I did here is I took all of the words and all of the priorities from UW System, from DNR, and from DATCAP, Department of Ag, and I created this sort of wordle is what they're called. So you can see what sorts of words or phrases jump out to you. Those are the ones that appear the most commonly. You see words like contaminants, water quality, management, PFAS, which is a new emerging contaminant of concern, pesticides, viruses, health, nitrogen, economics, etc. So we're really hopeful that the research community across the state will submit their best ideas and approaches to this competition. We typically do receive more outstanding proposals than we can fund. This is actually a really good thing for the state. There are other states that aren't in that situation and don't quite have that research capacity. We have outstanding researchers across the whole UW system, and it is a pretty intense competition. And like I said, we typically can't fund anywhere near all of the good proposals that are out there. And I'm hoping this year we continue to have good participation across the state. So next slide. So Wisconsin, like I said, is really fortunate to have a strong research community that's provided leadership in addressing our groundwater challenges through the years. This is just a sort of a snapshot of the projects that are currently funded through the program, so projects that are currently active. And you can see the words that are bolded and also get a glimpse at the variety of topics and the investigator teams that are out there. Some of the phrases that stand out and the titles are PFAS, bacteria, road salt, groundwater quantity in the central sands is a big issue, nitrate, economics, and pesticides. These are all some of the topics we're funding. Researchers come from across the UW system, and there are a variety of partners as well. And I listed the funding agencies as well on this slide. And we really do think, when you look at this sort of aggregate of projects across all of our different funding agencies, it's one of those things that together, I think we're a lot stronger than we were if we were all going about this on our own. So we're pretty proud of this collective effort that we make to support research across the state. So next slide. So one other benefit of working together collectively is coordinating on the accountability piece for this collective work. So if you're interested in past research projects, we house a report repository at this website, and it's searchable in a number of ways. You can search it by year, by topic, by researcher, etc. So these final reports for all of the projects across DNR and Department of Ag and UW system are available here. And then next slide. So in addition to supporting research, the Groundwater Coordinating Council also focuses on outreach. And again, it's really beneficial to work together. So here's one example of outreach conducted by the GCC, the Groundwater Coordinating Council. And this fact sheet's basically the result of all the GCC members pooling their knowledge about Wisconsin's groundwater to provide guidance to private well owners. I'm one of those, about the main problems we face here and how to test and evaluate your water. So thank you, team. I appreciate it. And so just one example of the many kind of outreach materials and resources that collectively this team helps produce. So next we've got Dr. Jonathan Meiman, and he'll provide some information about the health effects of bacteria, nitrate, arsenic, and PFAS, something I've mentioned a couple times, but I haven't defined. So Jonathan, I hope you'll do that. All of these have been issues that have been in the news so much lately.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I appreciate it. You kind of teed up nicely talking about the work of the Groundwater Coordinating Council and a lot of the focus on groundwater quality, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. So as Bruce said at the beginning, I'm one of the chief medical officers and I work in environmental health at the Department of Health Services. So what I wanted to do today, in just a few minutes, is just talk through some of these, some of the major contaminants that we see here in private well water across the state, specifically bacteria, nitrate, arsenic, and then PFAS, which is an emerging concern as well. And because these are so commonly found in a lot of wells, we want to make sure that the public has a good understanding of the risks these contaminants can pose to public health, what they need to do, what they can do to protect themselves through testing and other means. So I wanted to start here, at least with bacteria. So this is a really common contaminant that can be found in private wells. Bacteria, of course, are found everywhere in the environment, but when they do get into well water, it does present a risk to human health and can end up making us sick. So certain types of bacteria in particular particularly pose a risk for causing gastrointestinal infections. And that risk really is kind of greatest by the most vulnerable people. So we're thinking about young children and infants, people who are older, and then of course people with conditions that may impair their immune system. So when these certain types of bacteria, harmful bacteria, enter the well water, we are concerned about people who may be consuming it, particularly those more vulnerable people who may be living in a household. So as you see on the slide here, there are kind of a couple of bacteria that are commonly tested for in well water. Total coliform, that's just a group of very common bacteria, but it's kind of an indicator that if we find it in well water, that there may be an issue there, that it could be contaminated. And then moving down one from that, E. coli is a type of bacteria that's found in the gut of animals. So again, if a well owner tests their water and they find that E. coli are present, that means it could be contaminated by human or animal waste at that point. There are a lot of possible reasons for why a well may be contaminated. It could be because of the way it was constructed, potentially, if it wasn't built properly. But also can be a sign that there may be nearby sources of contamination, either from agriculture or things like septic systems. And so it's very important to test for this. And as Jen kind of alluded to on that previous slide with our communications, we really want to make sure that people test frequently, at least once a year, for the presence of bacteria in their well water. And then particularly if they notice any change in the smell or the color or the taste of the water, to test for it then. So very important thing that folks need to be aware of to keep themselves healthy. So moving on to the next slide. Nitrate is something that I think we hear a lot about here in the state. Again, a very common contaminant. This slide here kind of goes through a lot of the different particular kind of health concerns. I think it's important to kind of talk about what nitrate is. So nitrate is just simply a molecule. It's found all throughout nature, found in animals and plants. It's a very common substance. The risk really becomes when we get exposed to too much of nitrate, and some of those risks are described here on this slide. And the reason it may end up in wells is, again, kind of similar to the bacteria I was talking about, can be due to problems with the well construction, but also, and more frequently, runoffs from, say, agriculture, animal waste, septic systems, and things of that sort. And by far, it's one of the most common groundwater contaminants across the state. When we think about risks to human health, there are a lot that have been studied in the literature. There are, potential concerns if we think about risks to, say, thyroid health, potential linkages to birth defects, although that's something that's continually under study and is something that we're actively looking at and researchers are actively looking at. And then the thing that's most well studied, of course, are the risks to infants, and it can cause a rare but serious condition called blue baby syndrome, where a high level of nitrate impairs the ability of the blood to carry oxygen, and of course, results in kind of a bluish color when it happens. And so this is something we carefully monitor for here in the state through the Department of Health Services if this potentially occurs in young infants. And it's really a lot of the reason that we focus so much on making sure people stay below that protective level that we have shown here on the slide at that 10 milligrams per liter. So again, just with bacteria, very important to test at least once a year. But again, if there are vulnerable people in the household, say pregnant women or very young babies who are using the water, it's much more important to test more frequently than that. So if you have a new infant in the household and you're using, that infant is getting water, say for preparation of formula, important to test the water before you start using it if you're on a private well. So moving on to kind of the third and the next slide here, arsenic, a little bit of a departure here, I guess from the previous ones. With arsenic, there are different ways it can get in well water from natural sources and also from contamination from certain types of pesticides. But here in the state, it can be found in a lot of wells just because it's naturally occurring in soil and the rock. And that's particularly important on eastern portions of the state. Some areas have naturally high levels of arsenic. If people are exposed to arsenic to higher levels for long periods of time, it can also, like the other contaminants, have impact on health. With arsenic, it's a little different. And it's been well studied for many decades now, and it has been linked pretty closely to increased risk for certain types of cancer, particularly cancer of the lung, the bladder, or skin cancer. And that's also been shown to potentially impact the nervous system as well. Like the other contaminants, we worry about vulnerable populations, particularly young children, because arsenic exposure in very young children may have an impact on their future cancer risk and may have a potential impact on learning and IQ. So again, like the others, very important to test at least once a year. If you live in areas of the state that's shown on the slide where it's higher risk, that's Outagamie, Winnebago, and Brown counties, just kind of the natural deposits there, you can end up with higher amounts in your water. And then for other areas of state, important to test kind of right away. If you notice any change in the water kind of quality, taste, or color. So moving on to the last slide, again, as Jen mentioned, one of the emerging things you're probably hearing a lot about in the news, potentially in your own communities, are PFAS, or the full name is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So this is not one particular substance. This is actually many thousands of substances. They're all kind of chemically related in a way, chemical cousins, so to speak. But they have been around for quite a long time. They've been used in a lot of different industrial processes and a lot of different consumer products, really since the 1950s. And that wide use has resulted in kind of a legacy of contamination through much of this country. The people can be exposed, of course, in a lot of different ways, not just drinking water. But it can also be from, say, eating food or potentially swallowing contaminated dust that has been contaminated with PFAS. With drinking water, again, going back to that kind of historical legacy of use, these type of chemicals were and it's still to some extent widely used in firefighting foams. And when those foams are applied, of course, outside, they can end up seeping into groundwater and end up impacting wells, as has happened in a few places in the States. The health effects of PFAS are an active area of study. Although the chemicals have been around for many, many decades, there's still a lot we have to learn on their potential impacts on health. Some of the larger studies have pointed to risk in terms of its impact on cholesterol levels, potentially decreasing response to vaccines, and potential impacts on fertility. And DHS has done a lot of work with DNR in different communities impacted by PFAS, particularly in groundwater. There are a lot of ways to help mitigate that risk. A couple of the filtering solutions are shown here at the bottom of the slide of ways that if you're drinking, your well has been impacted, of ways you can help protect yourself. And of course, DHS and DNR are always available to provide lots of tailored advice to different communities and different homeowners. So I think to kind of wrap things up on the last slide here, I wanted to take a little bit of a step back to something that kind of Bruce and Steve mentioned, which is the importance of our groundwater standards here in the state and how they're very protective of human health. And just wanted to touch briefly on DHS's role in this. And this is a kind of a simplified infographic of a somewhat complicated process, but it really boils down to, DNR does an excellent job kind of monitoring issues throughout the state, identifying newer or emerging contaminants that are either impacting water currently or could, and does a really nice job kind of tracking those contaminants and keeping an eye on what we need to be looking forward to and what we may need to set standards for. So when DNR identifies some of those contaminants for which we need a health-based, science-based standard, they ask DHS to develop those. And that's the bureau I work in. We help develop those science-based standards. And what you see here on the infographic at the bottom is just kind of a simplified diagram of what we do. It's a pretty extensive process. It involves a lot of scientific review of different standards from around the country and from the EPA, reviewing thousands of scientific studies, and then writing that up both at high-level summaries that are kind of approachable for the general public and policymakers, as well as very detailed write-ups kind of describing our scientific rationale and how we arrive at those conclusions that we have. So we then provide those back to DNR, which then incorporates them into the rulemaking process. So I think I will end it there and turn it back over to you, Bruce, and looking forward to any questions we have.
Thank you, John and panel members. We kind of go into a panel discussion area at this time, and I myself may chime in from time to time as well. But I was thinking, maybe Steve, you mentioned the Wisconsin's groundwater law, and maybe you could tell me more about its history, how it came to pass, and some of the examples of contaminants that it's dealt with in the past.
Yeah,
and
sure.
How those standards have shown up.
Yeah, sure, Bruce. Thanks for that question. As we've mentioned here, in 1983, a sort of sweeping groundwater law was passed in Wisconsin, and really, that focuses on groundwater quality, right? The contaminants that are in our groundwater. How do we keep them out of our groundwater that we use for so many purposes? And really that law focused on this sort of process that John outlined, where we get health-based standards from the Department of Health Services, the toxicologists that they pore over the information in scientific studies to find out what is harmful to people to ingest through drinking water, and then they send those recommendations over to DNR for us to put into state law as a standard that groundwater shouldn't exceed this amount of contaminant. And then there's other programs like let's just say our landfill regulation program that then makes sure that what happens when they permit a landfill, it doesn't contaminate groundwater above those levels in our standards. Some of the key aspects of the groundwater law are that we consider all our aquifers, all the groundwater, to be a necessary valued resource. We don't want to contaminate any of it, which is, and just to compare to some other states and aspects of even some of our federal laws, are that in some other states and other places, they think, well, maybe this aquifer or this part of groundwater will allow to get contaminated because we have some sort of activity that we want to continue in our state, and we'll just say we'll sort of write off groundwater. We'll say that's okay if that gets contaminated. Well, that's not the basis of our model here in Wisconsin, and the basis of this law is that really all groundwater is important. We use it all across the state for drinking water and industrial purposes, and it should always be available and clean and meet the standards that we've set. And some of the contaminants that really drove this groundwater law and establishing it, some of those early ones were like atrazine, which was a pesticide used in weed control on corn crops, and there was really it had been found in groundwater. There was concern about it in groundwater and the impacts to public health. And from the agricultural industry in Wisconsin and elsewhere, there was concern that the groundwater law would limit growing corn in Wisconsin and really would be a burden to that industry. But what we found is we did institute groundwater standards for atrazine around 1991, and that we were successful in establishing those standards, which then led to limiting the amount of atrazine that got into groundwater and protecting then people that are drinking from private or public wells. It limited their impact from that atrazine. They were no longer drinking water that had atrazine in it. And so that was really a success in protecting groundwater in Wisconsin. Another one, just real quick, is benzene and other chemicals that are in gasoline. And that in the early 1990s, we added groundwater standards for those contaminants. And really they came from like leaking underground storage tanks where, the gas stations store the gas underground, and those tanks were leaking and contaminating groundwater. And the groundwater law really influenced new cleanup technology, so we could clean up those old leaking tanks. And it also inspired new types of tanks to come onto the market and become in use in Wisconsin that contained the gas and made sure that we didn't contaminate groundwater with those contaminants. So those are just a couple examples of how we've seen success in the past with our groundwater law, and we continue to after all these years. And one note here before I hand it back to you, Bruce, is that we've talked a lot about groundwater quality here, but we also have passed laws in Wisconsin related to groundwater quantity. And we won't go into that a lot here, but in 2003, some law was passed that set up groundwater management areas in the state, and also further defined how we treat high capacity wells. These are wells that pump a large volume of water regularly. And so it sets some new laws and groundwater quantity management, including registration and reporting of groundwater withdrawals from these high capacity wells. And we continue that work today to manage our groundwater quantity as well as our quality. So I hand it back to you, Bruce.
Thanks for that, Steve. And I guess I'll kind of add an editorial comment and maybe throw it partially back to Jen. But so, one of the key earlier contaminants dealt with by the law was the pesticide atrazine, used in agriculture. And I'm looking at an older report of the GCC, and it kind of points out that this became a funding area, and that there was a lot of research conducted by the university, and that like over 30 studies were funded through the Groundwater Coordinating Council looking at that to help find answers on how to manage that. And Jen, you mentioned that the Water Resources Institute has a repository. Is that, if somebody wants to follow up on an issue like that, can they go and actually find those studies? And is that a role that GC has played and continues to play?
Yeah, I think it's a really important accountability piece, which is what are the results of all of the work that's been funded collectively. Yeah, so it's all available at that repository. You can search by atrazine. Now that repository is sort of like, the scientific reports back to the GCC. Ideally then, and what mostly happens in addition to these scientific reports is that researchers publish the results of their work in the peer-reviewed literature, which is kind of the gold standards too. So other, additional information can be found in the peer-reviewed literature if people have access to that.
Great, thank you for that. And yeah, Dr. Meiman, you mentioned arsenic and naturally occurring, and I would just point out also the Groundwater Coordinating Council funded, trying to scroll down and find the number, but a lot of research was done via the Groundwater Coordinating Council to find out where that is, to find out if it is naturally occurring, and confirm that. And actually, the research funded through that process found that there are some issues. If you have a bacteria issue with your well, but you're in an arsenic area, you should be more careful and follow a different way of disinfecting your well so that you don't trigger additional release of arsenic. So just identifying these key health issues and then having the Groundwater Coordinating Council has really kind of coalesced a lot of information gathering that we can then turn around to well owners to tell them how to better manage their private well. One kind of question I had for you, Steve, was along the lines then of Wisconsin is trying to protect all of the groundwater, and some other states do not. Kind of two-part question: how often do public wells have a problem, and if they do have a problem, do they just serve that water out? And I guess the kind of follow-up piece was, if we were to write off entire aquifers, that would really kind of change, I'm thinking, the distribution and costs to well owners. Like, it wouldn't be as easy to have your cabin and put in a well if you had to like drill twice as deep to avoid a shallow aquifer, let's say. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. So a lot of times it's cheaper and easier if the groundwater is clean to begin with, right? We do have a lot of technology at our disposal these days to treat drinking water, to make it clean. But if it's clean to start with, that's a whole lot easier and less expensive for a homeowner, say. Jen mentioned she has a private well, at her home, and being able to operate that well without any treatment on it, that's a significant cost savings for the homeowner. What we find too is that sometimes where, particularly with nitrates, we may have to drill a much deeper well than is really necessary because of any other reason, right? But just because there's nitrates up in the aquifer, in the groundwater up near the surface, we have to drill deeper to get into good quality water, and that's at a cost. That costs a lot more to have that drill rig drill down that far. It costs more for the metal casing that has to be installed down to a deeper depth. So that's a real cost to homeowners, and it's also a cost to public water system. Municipal water systems drill very deep wells, and some of them in Wisconsin put on treatment for nitrates and other contaminants to get those out of the groundwater that they're extracting from the ground, and that cost gets passed on to the ratepayers, the people paying for that water, the consumers of that water from that municipal system. So when we, so beyond groundwater protection, like for public water supplies, we do protect the consumers through various means. Some of them is testing of the water. We regularly require public water systems to test their water for, if you're talking about municipal systems, it's over 90 different contaminants that they test for on a regular basis. When they get information from those tests that indicates there might be an issue of contamination of that water, they notify the public. So there's public notification of that information, and provide information to the public, to the consumers, about how they can protect themselves, what the health concerns are with that contaminant that they found in there, and generally what the utility is going to do next to try to either remove or protect the consumers from that contaminant. So there's testing and public notice, and then we also do inspections and review of the infrastructure itself. So we regularly inspect every 3 years municipal water systems to make sure that they are designed and maintained properly to provide safe drinking water to the consumers there. So that's another key component. And along with that, we do engineering plan review. We review the plans. If there's new treatment plants that go in, or if they're going to drill a new well, we make sure that they're going to meet the state standards, and also address any site-specific concerns. If there's, for instance, what we've been talking about here today, nitrates in the shallow groundwater, we'll make sure that they're drilling that municipal well down to a depth that will avoid those nitrate concerns. So engineering plan review is important before that infrastructure goes in, that they're going to meet the standards and be a good resource for that community. So those are some of the ways we protect groundwater or drinking water by regulating and oversight of public water systems.
Thanks for that, Steve. I guess for any or all, maybe one additional question. John and Steve, you walked through Department of Health Services role in setting standards, and DNR publishes those. And Steve, you mentioned some historical setting for atrazine, setting standard for arsenic and benzene and related gasoline compounds. A lot of times at the beginning of that, though, there's a lot of a fear that both on the public side, that why is this there? What level is harmful to me? And on the industry side, that this will be just so costly to ever deal with. How will we ever do that? But has that been, we've had more than 30 some years of experience of going through this process. How do you feel about both being able to answer people's health concerns and regulations to this point, finding out a way to deal with those issues, like landfills adjusting their practices, et cetera?
Maybe I can start on the health side. I mean, the principles we kind of always come back to are transparency about what we know and what we don't know, and using the best scientific knowledge we have at hand to provide good science-based recommendations that are going to be protective of people's health. Kind of the more modern or the more recent example, right, with PFAS, as I mentioned when I was talking, there still is a lot to be learned about the potential health impacts. When you look at populations of people that have been exposed to a contaminant, for example, it may take many years or many decades, right, to kind of follow those people along and really fully understand what the health implications are. So, our goal really is to kind of translate what we know as best we can to people in a way that's very approachable and understandable, acknowledging the scientific uncertainties where they are. But taking what we do know and using that to set a level or make a recommendation to DNR that we're certain is going to be very protective of health. Uncertainty is something we're used to dealing with. There's always going to be uncertainty in science, but you can take that into account when in making a recommendation and coming up with a level that is conservative, that we are confident, given the current state of scientific knowledge, that if we keep contaminant below that level, it's not going to pose a significant risk to human health. And that's really our goal, is to come up with something that is conservative, scientifically based, and protective, regardless of how far we are along in researching a particular chemical. So, Steve, I don't know if you have anything to add on to that.
Yeah, and as we've stated before, we take those health-based recommendations that the scientists have recommended, and we, as Bruce said, we publish them in chapter NR 140 through a process that involves lots of public input, and we do hear the various sides of whether this should be regulated as and put into a standard. We consider all sorts of additional health information that we might get through public input processes, and then we set those standards, and through that process we hear a lot about you mentioned the fear, Bruce. We hear a lot about how these contaminants are used in our industries in Wisconsin, and I think what we've shown is that there is a balance there, that we're able to protect public health through regulating these substances through the Groundwater Law, but do it in a way that doesn't overly burden our industries, and allows commerce still to happen in our state. And so I think it's a great model, and I think it is set up to serve us well for many years to come. And even as we find new contaminants like PFAS that we didn't know about 5 or 10 years ago, and but now we know occurs in our groundwater. The law gives us a model to address that, and hopefully find ways to clean up the PFAS in our groundwater, but most importantly, to protect people from exposure in moving forward to PFAS, particularly in their drinking water.
Thank you for that. And Jen, I'll just throw a plug in, and I bet you the UW system stands ready to help. If we have research kind of questions about how to deal with, say, PFAS, I bet you there's researchers ready and willing and able to help answer questions for us.
Like you said, something I think is in some ways not entirely unique, but is pretty cool about Wisconsin is that I think the research community is very engaged with like communities across the state, with our state agencies, and just with state needs. There's just I think the GCC kind of set that kind of model of coordination, and it just carries across all sorts of things with, there's a PFAS action team and all sorts of things where, again, that agency coordination is just basically the expectation. So yeah, I think that's particularly true here. And just a couple quick, I'll keep these really quick examples of just quick things from the university system on the PFAS issue. I mean, one really basic thing you don't think about is just analytical capabilities. Steve mentioned we didn't hear a whole lot about PFAS until about the last 5 to 10 years. And there was a Husky oil refinery explosion a couple years ago up in Superior. And it was in that event where obviously the big firefighting effort, lots of firefighting foam, which is one of the sources of one of the compounds of PFAS, where some rapid response monitoring took place just to see what might be going into the streams or Lake Superior. And we realized really quickly, like it was hard to find a lab in the state that could analyze for some of the PFAS compounds in water. So the university, through Wisconsin Sea Grant, actually teamed up with the State Lab of Hygiene to provide just some base support to develop more analytical capabilities for even analyzing for PFAS in water. We've teamed up with DHS to provide a postdoctoral fellow who is kind of an expert toxicologist who could help develop some of those standards for some of the PFAS compounds in groundwater. And then lots of great individual researchers in labs, UW-Milwaukee, UW-Madison. We've got folks in Green Bay and beyond who have different expertise related to either monitoring or analyzing or understanding fate and transport of PFAS in both surface and groundwaters.
Well, Steve, Jen, and John, thank you so much for your time today. I don't have any more questions for you. I think we're approaching the end of our time, but I really also mainly want to thank everyone for tuning in and paying attention to our Safe Water for All campaign and this Protecting the People, the panel discussion today on water quality. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks,
Thank you, and thank you to all the attendees.